for Chapter 12 of Girlcott by Florenz Webbe Maxwell. By Thursday, the class was abuzz with news about the boycott. Many of them had attended and were all talking about the event. Whenever I looked in Eileen's direction, she tossed her head and turned away from me. Not being able to contribute made her angry because I had refused to go to the boycott when Papa gave permission. He even bragged about the number of young people who were there. This boycott is making history, he kept saying over and over like a stuck record. You two should not miss it. Those young people mixed in like grown-ups. You should have seen them. I surprised my parents and Eileen when I said I did not want to witness this historic boycott, having asked permission to go in the first place. But now I didn't trust myself to go near the event. No telling what would slip out about Mrs. Burroughs being in the progressive group. I tried to persuade Eileen to go, but she insisted that there was no point in going without me. I was not paying too much attention to what was going on in class until Stella Hart, a quiet girl, stood up and held everyone spellbound when she said her neighbor was approached by a reporter because of a large placard she was carrying. The words were big and they said, "Do not patronize these theaters. Remember, when the cause has been won, you are not part of it." Her quiet voice filled every corner of the room. "What happened?" Dedrick asked, jumping up from his desk to stand next to her. "Go sit down, Dedrick. The reporter was not a policeman," someone shouted from the back of the room. "I still want to know what happened." He turned around, scowled at his intruder, and then swung back to face Stella, his nose almost touching hers. "What did your neighbor say?" She backed away and fanned off his breath. "He just said, if you want it for your paper, write it. If you don't have to know who printed it." The class laughed and Dedrick went back to his seat. My question was not so dumb after all. The smirk remained on his face for the rest of the period. After Stella's performance, others began yelling about the placards they had seen at the boycott. Wait a minute. Head girl Gloria Grimes tripped up to the blackboard and snatched up a piece of chalk. She then pointed it at the class. "One at a time, I've got to write them down." Someone yelled, "Listen to this one. We all read about fighting for a free world, but how can it be a free world if our color makes a difference?" "Not so fast. I'm not a typewriter." Gloria was writing quickly, yet not sacrificing good penmanship for speed. Kate, one of Bella's maids in waiting, immediately jumped up and recited the slogan her brother had seen. Every word was enunciated carefully through proper pursed lips. "Keep it up. We're winning." She then looked around the class to see what effect her recitation had on the class. Unfortunately for her, too many others wanted to take center stage, and on cue, someone yelled from the back, "The placard my father saw said, 'Don't go to the movies.'" Then another voice, "The boycott must go on. Keep it up. No violence." The placards were more interesting than I expected, and I could not get over the fact that many heads were bent over books, copying down the slogans as if they were a class assignment. Gloria's hand flew across the blackboard faster than an electric typewriter. When she underlined the words "no violence," the chalk squeaked from the force of the double lines she drew under the word. I shuddered, but was too interested in what was going on to put my hands over my ears. Hugh jumped in front of the class again and shouted as he waved his hands around like a windmill, "That progressive group is a fraud. They talk about no violence, but—" "Sit yourself down, Hugh. Glue yourself to your seat." But Hugh only shouted louder, "They talk about no violence, but my cousin has got a threatening call." "Sit down. Let him finish," Gloria yelled above the uproar. "He might have something interesting to say for a change." At the head girl's command, the noise level dropped. "As I was saying," Hugh paused and looked around him, "get on and say it, or sit down." Her tone made him rush on before anyone else could interrupt. "My cousin, who belongs to a film club, received an anonymous call from a member of the progressive group, warning him not to attend any of the theaters or anyone in the club would get hurt badly enough to receive flowers." There was a brief silence. Then Eileen, in her lawyer voice, almost overturned her desk when she sprang up and said, "That doesn't make sense. How could a member of the progressive group threaten any person when the whole emphasis is on nonviolence?" Eileen was right, but I said nothing. Not to be outdone, Bella challenged Eileen. Any group sneaky enough to hide behind the scene would pull a trick like that, she shouted. Hugh opened his mouth to speak when Dedrick yelled, I still say they should do what the theater people say. Come face to face and negotiate. Then several voices began to chant, face to face and negotiate, face to face and negotiate, face to face. I looked around the room in disgust. Was this the group I had planned to take to the theaters to break down segregation? My eyes settled on Dedrick, who was on the teacher's desk, tap dancing to the beat of the chanting voices, and then on to Bella and her maids in waiting, clapping and whistling. If the people outside the theater behaved like these hooligans, I dared not think of the result. George tried to restore order by writing names on the board, but the offenders paid him no attention. Eileen had her head on her desk, her hands covering her ears. If only I could block out this scene. My classmates had no clue that the boycott was serious. A teacher could be arrested. Lives could be lost in a riot. Getting another detention was one thing, but a riot was far worse. Maybe I should try to make them understand how important it was to end this stupid policy where people had to be kept separate just because of race. We should be thinking of a way to help. I walked to the front of the class, but couldn't open my mouth. The words just stuck into my throat. I clapped my hands for attention, but the only ones who noticed were those not involved in the commotion. I returned to my desk, grabbed up the maths book, and stomped out of the room. As I headed towards the library, I could still hear the noise, now at a dangerous crescendo. I was relieved to find the library empty. This did not come as a surprise because it was occupied mainly by Form 5. Calling the room a library was really a misnomer, for no one checked out the few classics on the shelves and there was no librarian. Its original purpose was to store janitorial equipment. Then a year ago, someone wired a stick across a mop for arms and hung it from the old exercise book with oldie goldie civic notes given to the class of 1866 written on the cover. Overnight, the room was transformed into a library, and to my surprise, no culprit was brought to justice. I noticed that the shelves had not been touched, dusted maybe by the janitor, for the room had the smell of creosote, a strong disinfectant that tickled my nose. Ignoring the pungent odor, I flopped down in the cedar chair at the lone desk near the only window that grudgingly allowed some sunlight to make a trail across the wooden floor. I was about to open the window to let the pungent smell escape when George appeared in the doorway. Mr. Lewis wants to see you in his office, he said. So matter-of-factly, I immediately suspected trouble. Don't tell me it's detention. I'm the scapegoat again. You're one of the school's special people, so being summoned to the office has to be an honor. For the office, of course. His voice was deep and musical. He made a move to step into the library, then backed out into the doorway as if he were walking off stage. I picked up my unopened maths book and tried not to look directly at him, for I could feel my face burning hot, and I did not want him to notice that he was having that effect on me. Give me your maths book. I'll take it back to the class. You would look odd going into the office with a maths book. He took the book and held on to my hand. Sorry, he said when I pulled away without looking directly at him. I wasn't being fresh. That's all right, I spluttered. I mean, I didn't think you were being fresh, I added quickly. I'd better see what Mr. Lewis wants. George gave his lopsided smile and bowed as I passed him on the threshold. Unlike Eileen, who thought every boy was cute, my mind was always focused on my studies. Now I wondered if I'd been missing something special. When I walked into Mr. Lewis's office, all thought of George evaporated, for seating in the chairs beside the headmaster's large cedar desk were none other than Mrs. Burrows and Mrs. Goldenrod. Neither of them looked up when I entered the room, but they responded in duet to my greeting, their eyes fastened on sheets of paper in their laps. Mr. Lewis, who had been looking over their shoulders, walked over to me and beamed, exhibiting a full set of dentures. His deep-set eyes were expressionless, and they did not harmonize with his too broad a smile. Just make yourself comfortable, Desma, he said as he pulled out the lone empty chair near his desk. He waited until I was seated and then went to his chair on the opposite side. I am afraid I have bad news for you concerning the Empire Scholarship. Mr. Lewis was known to never beat around the bush. He always went directly to the roots. When he sat down, I could swear I felt the wooden floor vibrate, but this could have been the tremor that went through my body. My brain wanted my tongue to say something, but every organ seemed to be frozen solid. My hands folded in my lap, thawed out first, and began to tremble. I squeezed them together and waited for Mr. Lewis to explain what the Empire Scholarship had to do with my being summoned to his office, especially if it meant bad news. I looked across at Mrs. Burrows, but her eyes were still fastened on the paper she held, and I somehow had the feeling that she was not concentrating on what was on her lap. Oldie Goldie, as was her natural habit, stared straight at me, but her head was at an acute angle and a soft expression formed around the corners of her mouth. I closed my eyes to shut out the feeling that something ominous was dangling in the air. When I felt a hand on my shoulder, I looked up to see Mr. Lewis standing beside me. I was not even aware that he'd left his seat. I was telling you, Desma, I have a copy of a letter that was signed by 5 white men here in Bermuda who object to your receiving the Empire Scholarship. They have sent the original to the Scholarship Committee in the United Kingdom. He went back to his desk, picked up a sheet of paper, and then dropped it as if it had burned his hand. These white men think their names carry a lot of weight, he continued, leaning on his desk, but they won't get away with this. I called an emergency teachers meeting on Monday so that we can come up with a strategy to beat them at the right game. You must trust us, Desma. Now I knew why our detention was called off on Monday and why no teacher had bothered with the noise pouring out of the classroom today. Here I was, caught up in the tangled web of the boycott through no doing of my own. My mind flashed to the Wallaces and Mr. Townsend and couldn't help feeling that their signatures were on the letter. Mrs. Goldenrod spoke in her detention voice. This is not a Bermuda scholarship doled out to one of their white students. This Empire Scholarship is given on merit and judged by an overseas committee. Exactly, interrupted Mr. Lewis. Desma won over all the other Commonwealth students, colored and white, and we're going to fight so that justice also wins. They went on talking, but my mind wasn't on the conversation. My stomach, my intestines, even my brain seemed to be all tangled up, and I couldn't find the words to explain how I was really feeling. Everything I knew had changed. I wasn't the same Desma. Too much had happened in the last few days that had opened my eyes to the ugliness behind segregation. Losing the scholarship was the last straw. I couldn't look at the award cups lined on the shelf behind Mr. Lewis's desk. I would be the recipient of most of them. The one most prized was the Collegiate Cup, awarded to the student who excelled academically as well as in deportment. I would get that cup all right, but not the Empire Scholarship. A lump stuck in my throat when I thought that even my name inscribed on it did not guarantee the scholarship. Without the scholarship, I could not afford to go to college in September. Papa had lost so many customers thanks to Mr. Townsend. Did this mean those men would call in our mortgage next? I'd never heard my parents talking about a mortgage, but until recently, they never talked about segregation either. My eyes were stinging with tears I refused to allow to escape, and I dared not look up for fear I would lose control and become thoroughly embarrassed. What would the white people do to Mrs. Burrows if they were so horrible to me and my family? The tears rolled down my cheek and watered my clasped hands. A perfumed white handkerchief was pushed into my clutched palm, and an arm rubbed my shoulders. I looked up and was surprised to see Mrs. Goldenrod staring down at me. Justice will prevail, she said in her matter-of-fact voice. Those men have no authority over the Empire Scholarship Committee. If they get away with this, no telling how far they will go. She squeezed me harder. Are you all right? I'm all right, I lied as I handed her back the handkerchief and tried to smile. Thanks, Mrs. Goldenrod. Looking out of the corner of my eye, I saw that Mrs. Burrows was standing near her chair. She had not moved in my direction, and her face looked as miserable as I felt. Desma, I have already notified your parents, Mr. Lewis told me. Your father gave me permission to break the news to you before you came home. He felt you could handle it. Good old Papa. I knew him well enough to understand that he needed a cooling off period. The headmaster must have worked a miracle to keep him from stomping up to the school, pouring out his venom. It was one thing controlling Mr. Townsend, but another matter defending my reputation. Desma is a brave, intelligent girl, Mrs. Burrows said. I'm optimistic that all will end well. She still wasn't looking at me, and I wondered if she was thinking of the boycott as a solution, but there was no way I could ask the question. It has to. I think we should end on that note. Mr. Lewis came from around his desk, patted me on the shoulder, and then took both of my hands as he gently pulled me to my feet. Mrs. Burrows is right. You are a brave, intelligent girl, and I have every confidence that you will not let this horrible incident destroy your confidence. When I walked towards the door, he added, "You have my permission to be dismissed. I will also wait to call an assembly tomorrow morning," explaining the situation. "Whatever happens, I don't want the students to act up and give those men the excuse to perpetuate more maleficence." I knew that I could not go back to the classroom, for everyone would want to know why I had to go to the office, and Eileen would not let the matter drop until everyone was whipped into a frenzy. Just remembering the noisy classroom that I had escaped earlier, I could not wait to exit the building. "Desma," Mrs. Burrows was beside me. "Come to my classroom," she said, taking my hand. "We need to talk." When she opened the door, the smells from the empty desks, the shelf of math books near the blackboard, and even her perfume, Lilies in the Sunset, all greeted me, making me feel nostalgic. I realized how much I had missed our many chats about my future and maths problems that I had found interesting to solve. "We have this room to ourselves for an hour while the Form 4 students are doing their geography exam in the assembly hall," she said, opening the window near her desk. A fresh breeze rushed in and scattered the various scents, leaving only her perfume hanging in the air. Sitting down at a desk nearest the window, I gazed around at the familiar setting, a setting that had molded my confidence and had encouraged me to aim toward becoming an actuary. Mrs. Burrows believed my mathematical skills were pointing in that direction, and how right she was. I must have read every book on the subject and was even accepted into a college in Canada, renowned for its high academic reputation for graduating top actuaries. I had dreamed about starting there in September, aided by the Empire Scholarship. Now, thanks to people like the Wallaces and Mr. Townsend, I lost the scholarship, my career as an actuary, and goodness knows what else they had waiting around the corner to be snatched away from me. Now, thanks to this boycott, for the first time, I couldn't be honest with Mrs. Burrows. My secret ate my insides. "You're not yourself," Mrs. Burrows said, standing over me. "You haven't been to see me in days. Is something wrong? I'm not referring to the Empire Scholarship. You just learned about that." "I'm worried about the boycott." The words gushed out. "It looks like we're going to fail and people are going to get hurt." I didn't look directly at her for fear that she would read my secret. Mrs. Burrows went over to her desk and dragged her chair opposite mine. She raised my chin so that I was forced to look straight at her. "What gives you that impression? So far, it's going as planned. Many Bermudians are not going to the theaters." There was no clue that she was a member of the progressive group or that she was frightened about being discovered and punished. I had to marvel at her self-control in keeping the secret. This made me feel more protective of her and the group, and I shuddered to think what would happen if the special branch was successful in finding out who they were. More Bermudians would come out if they knew who's in the progressive group. I thought of Mama and added, "I know of people who think they are foreign and feel segregation is our problem. We should be fighting it ourselves." For a while, Mrs. Burrows did not answer. When she did, she leaned close to me and said, "There's no guarantee that they will be supported. The boycott stands a chance of being successful if Bermudians concentrate on the message and not the messenger. Do you know this because you're a member of the progressive group?" I looked directly at her as I spoke. I thought she was going to have a heart attack, for her hands flew wide open, and then she clasped them as if in prayer. "What did you say?" Instead of repeating the sentence, I told her how I had seen the car near the tennis stadium on Sunday and had watched while she and I believe her husband pasted the posters on the telephone poles. "Oh my God," she exhaled slowly. Since her hands were still clasped, I felt this was more of a prayer than blasphemy. The silence in the classroom was so thick. It fell heavy on my chest, and I dared not move for fear it would crush every organ in my body. The time dragged on for 2 lifetimes as I sat rigid on my seat, waiting for the next move. "This is very frightening," Mrs. Burrows said at last. "We took every precaution to keep our actions under cover." She stood up, paced back and forth, and making the silence more ominous. Nobody was around. I said, reassuring her. I know for sure, for I was looking out for the police. I was riding my mobilette without a license. I added the last sentence to emphasize that I too was afraid of being caught. I haven't told a soul, not even Eileen. I know I can trust you. She walked over to me and sat down in the chair again. We both concluded that my being at the scene was a rare coincidence. And now that it was all out in the open, there was so much I wanted to know. I still can't understand why the group is secret. Why are you hiding? If people knew who you were, they would come out in droves and the government would think twice about pulling out the special branch to arrest you. They would be scared of so many people protecting you all. I couldn't keep the fear and worry from creeping into my voice. We're not hiding, Desma. This is a strategy. There's an expression, familiarity breeds contempt. Mrs. Burroughs said, if Bermudians know who we are, they'll spend more time asking us who do we think we are than listening to our message. We're not prominent people. They have no reason to listen to us. Because we're anonymous, they believe we are foreigners, important people, whatever. So we stand a better chance of getting the message across. She paused. It's also safe not to be known. The powers that be can be vengeful, and not just the government. I closed my eyes and tried to process this information. The scene with the Wallaces, Mr. Townsend, and now the scholarship flashed through my mind. When I opened them, she was looking at me, her head at an acute angle and her brow in two parallel lines. My favorite teacher was now more my hero. Keeping the group a secret does make sense, I agreed, but boycotting the theater doesn't. You can walk into the theater, sit in the white people's seats, and not get arrested because you won't be breaking the law. Segregation is only a policy, so breaking it isn't a crime. A smile flashed on her face and the lines disappeared. That's smart, Desma, but the boycott is not about sitting in the white people's seats. It's about breaking down segregation, period. Nearly everything in Bermuda is segregated. Colored people are not allowed to work in the post office, the banks, stay in hotels. The list is legion. Even colored doctors and nurses are barred from the hospital. Let's say you got sick and had to go to the hospital. You would have to be turned over to a white doctor. And in the hospital, you would be put in a segregated ward. So why didn't you boycott the hospital or one of those other places? Why the theater? I couldn't help thinking that if they had my birthday celebration would not have had a problem. I was ashamed of the feeling. I wanted to help. I didn't want my disappointment to get in the way anymore. We decided on the movies because it's popular. Colored Bermudians pay a lot of money to be segregated. She gave a dry laugh and I laughed with her. We could have staged a boycott of the hotels or even the restaurants, but those places were patronized by tourists and they would not be interested in solving Bermuda's problems. They see this island as a paradise. Segregation is our problem, and we have to solve it. You sound like my father, I said, remembering how I'd almost paid to be segregated as well. I want to help to make the boycott a success, but I can't think of a way. If only I could come up with an equation to get my idea across. Words get in the way. I'm sure you'll come up with something. Mrs. Burroughs made me feel so special. My confidence began to seep back since the news about the scholarship. I need a solution. I want to put what I learned today into an equation like Einstein's theory of relativity. I remember when I first came across this equation, E equals mc squared. I asked you to explain it to me. I still can't understand all of it, but I can appreciate he's a genius. I wish I could come up with an idea that could be understood in a simple equation. Mrs. Burroughs laughed. Actually, Einstein did come up with a formula that you can understand. He gave it to a famous artist, Samuel Wolfe, and it goes like this. If A is success in life, then A equals X plus Y plus Z. X is work, Y is play, and Z is keep your mouth shut. That's simple enough. I repeated it aloud, feeling the excitement of each word. If A is success in life, then A equals X plus Y plus Z. X is work, Y is play, and Z is keep your mouth shut. That's doable. I repeated the equation and felt as if my brain had taken a wing. When I left Mrs. Burroughs, I felt like a new person. Before I reached home, I had a plan to support the theater boycott. Better still, I had simplified it into an equation.